Good morning. It is Scott from The Mirror Point, where reality checks itself. How's it going, everybody? Today's topic that I came up with, just reacting to Bernardo Kastrup, who is like a speaker, popular speaker for idealism, analytic idealism, if you don't know who he is. And he recently did a video not long ago. I believe it was yesterday it was published, or actually the day before yesterday on the 15th on Bernardo Kastrup EU channel. And it was called The Greatest Challenge to Bernardo's Naturalism, right? And so he's talking about NDEs, or near-death experiences. Now, for those who don't know, and most people do by now, near-death NDEs, or near-death experiences, are claims people make when they come near death of experiences that they've had, like after they've separated from their body, for example. They see and hear things, feel things, think. And there's a lot of core commonalities, like a life review, a bright light, going through a tunnel, meeting with dead loved ones, out of body experience. In other words, seeing what's going on veridically, what you call a veridical experience, like seeing stuff in the operating room if they happen to have a cardiac arrest in the in an operating room, for example. Now, obviously, a lot of this stuff flies in the face of naturalism, because in the natural world, people don't live after they die, right? That's what death means, the end of life. So NDEs contradict what we know about the natural world. You know, as long as you're alive, you can have an experience. But if you're dead, you know, it's thought that you can't have an experience because your brain has flatlined. Your sense perceptions are no longer online. You're no longer processing information. You can measure your brain, it flatlines, your heart flatlines. And so there's nothing that would give us reason to think that you're experiencing anything after you die. That would be ridiculous. And nonetheless, you've got millions of people out here saying that they had a cardiac arrest, they came near death, and they were able to meet with their loved ones, go through a tunnel, see a light, all of these fantastical, extraordinary things, claims that they make. How can that really be true? And what would better explain those? I mean, the most parsimonious is that they're all lying. People lie. We know people lie. People want to sell books. People want to become popular. People want favor with the world. And so they tell such stories in order to gain fame and money and things like that. That's probably the most logical reason for why people claim near-death experience. They're lying. Why should we believe any of that bullshit? Right? The second law of thermodynamics, you know, in the natural world, you know, things go from order to disorder. When you die, that's a consequence of how matter behaves in the world. We observe that. There is no life that goes on. people that claim they've had near-death experiences, from a logical point of view, the most parsimonious thing is that they're probably lying, or they're probably confused. Maybe they had a dream and they just got confused and they just happened to come back. That's one perspective. So on naturalism, life after death is just a claim. It's just a belief. Like we get that from religion. It's wishful thinking. It's magical thinking. Others say, why would these people lie? Actually, they become outcasts in society by talking about their near-death experience, that they don't benefit from telling these stories, right? That's what the other view would say. But how can we prove either way? These people were near death. They didn't actually die. So like I actually was very interested in near-death experiences for a long time. And I used to go to meetings at the International Association of Near-Death Studies years ago and talk to all kinds of people about their experiences. And, they all basically say the same thing, the light, the tunnel, the feeling of love, the meaning of the loved ones, all of these sort of stories. And some came out of the experiences after that, their life totally changed. They quit their religions, or maybe they joined a religion, or they became, they had a different perspective on things like God, meaning of life, things like that. Because these experiences apparently are very profound for them. And the question, is how could you ever prove that these things are real? Is it true that the skeptics are right, that, there's no room for life after death? How would you prove such a thing? So a lot of people talk about veridical experiences, like tests, like being able to see things or hear things in the theater of the operating room when their brain was offline, and seeing if there's time stamps that you can sort of reference to see if their story checks out. And so we have a case of Pam Reynolds. And this is one of these very compelling sort of near-death experience. This is from Hospice Nurse Channel. She's a hospice nurse, Julie. And she talks about situations on her channel about her patients that claim to have near-death experiences, even her own experiences. You have things like shared death experiences, where not only the patient is having these experiences, but the people around in the vicinity of the patient share in her experience. They see and feel and hear some of the things that they also experience. Very weird. Could they be making this stuff up? Is it just, and she talks about terminal lucidity, like right before you die, maybe a dementia patient all of a sudden can recall everything and act very lucid. They sort of come online, so to speak, and act normal all of a sudden with no explanation. There's no explanation for this terminal lucidity, as they call it. It's kind of mysterious. There's no explanation from now. So because there's no explanation, does that mean that near-death experiences are true? If we use our logical mind, would this mean that this proves NDEs are true? Well, let's hear the story of Pam Reynolds as explained from Hospice nurse Julie, and we'll see what she has to say. And then I'm going to go into Bernardo Kastrup, who talks about near-death experiences and its relationship to idealism. I lean towards idealism as well. I'm also a naturalistic idealist. And so this topic, of course, is very interesting, and we'll hear what he has to say. But for now, let's take a listen to hospice nurse Julie, see what she has to say on that.
Whew, okay, folks, let's buckle up for this one, because if we want to talk near-death experiences, this is one of the coolest ones I have read in recent times. So Pam Reynolds was a woman who was diagnosed with a very rare type of aneurysm that most surgeons in the whole United States were like, no, this is inoperable. We're not going to do it. I'm not a neurologist, so I don't know exactly why, but I know that where it was placed in her brain, it would be very difficult to get to or something like that. And it was a very, very dangerous surgery to be had. So she was young. She was in her 30s. This was in the 90s. And she basically had to search all over the country to find a surgeon skilled and willing to do this particular surgery. Okay, so right there, it already kind of raises the stakes. She was eventually referred to and found a surgeon who was willing to do this, named Dr. Spetzler. I could be saying that wrong, but something like that. Dr. Spetzler. He's a world-renowned surgeon and willing to do this. Now, the reason why this is extra dangerous surgery is because they had to do what was called a standstill, which is basically the person who's being operated on, which is Pam Reynolds, has to clinically put into a cardiac arrest. So they clinically put her in something called a hypothermic cardiac arrest.
Okay, so she's saying that they're setting this up to where she's effectively brain dead. Her heart rate is either very low or flatlined, I guess. And she's put in very low temperature in order to maintain, enough of her body functions in order to bring her back, so to speak. So this is the setup. Hypothermic cardiac arrest is what they'll call it, in order to put that person into that state. All right. So we'll check this out here. Uh-oh. Hello? Oh, my woo-woo calculator's going off. It's telling me that this is complete bullshit. Okay. Anyways, let's keep going.
Her body is basically drained of her blood, put on a bypass machine. She has things put in her ears, which are making like a real kind of noise into her ear, which somehow will help the doctors know that her brain is basically offline, that she is like quote unquote brain dead. She has EEGs, like they want her brain to be not working. They want her blood to not be flowing so they can fix this aneurysm in the brain. Again, very, very high risk surgery. I'm going to actually try to read this to you in plain English so we can all understand the complications of the surgery, okay? They lower her body temperature, her heart is stopped, her brain is stopped. It is put off on basically on other machines. There's other machines outside of her body continuing to like keep her heart pumping and breathing, but she's not technically doing it. It's complicated.
So she's not really dead. She wouldn't really be dead. That's the point. Her bodily functions are lowered, but she's not technically passed on. Death is more of a process, and it takes hours to actually be considered truly dead. But for all intents and purposes, she's dead, I guess, clinically. Like when you record the time of death, it's based on, the heart, the brain, the flat line, how the machines measure that stuff. But we also know that death is a process. It isn't immediate. There isn't like a strict demarcation line. But anyways, let's keep going.
Brain activity was monitored with EEGs, those things on your brain. Her brain stem responses were monitored through the ear clickings, those things in her ears. And then during this time, she can have no measurable brain activity. So she is clinically brain dead. Now, this is purposely done so they can fix the aneurysm. So that's important here. That's important because if your brain is no longer giving activity, technically, you should not experience all the things she experienced. So let's get into that cool part, okay? So once she made it through the surgery, which is a miracle of its own, thank you, surgeons, that's amazing. You know, the fact that she like made it through is amazing. They brought her back to life once the surgery was done. This is something that's done not often, but it can be done where you're put on like a bypass machine and kind of kept alive that way. So they brought her back, and once she recovered, she woke up and needed to tell her surgeons this because
Okay, so she was out. She shouldn't have had any sort of experience during this particular time. And now she's waking up in order to relay what she actually experienced while she was out. Okay, so that's where we are so far. Sorry, I have to pause these videos. I just don't want the stream to get, shut down. Anyways, we'll keep going.
It goes in 3 different parts. So first, she says she woke up in the operating room, first by sound, which they were like, that's really strange because the only sound, 1, you shouldn't be hearing sound, but 2, if you did, your ears had the noise going on, right? But that's not what she heard. She heard the sound of a saw, and she saw a saw cutting into her brain. She said it looked just like my electric toothbrush, she said, which is what those saws actually look like. It's not like an actual saw that we're used to seeing. It's like a mechanical saw that does make a noise like a saw, but it can look a little bit like an electronic toothbrush, supposedly. So she said that's what she first woke up to while she was in the operating room, okay? Then she got sight, which is impossible because first off, her brain was shut down. Second off, her eyes were taped down. She saw the operating room, and she said she looked like she was looking from where the surgeon was. So she was like almost like on the surgeon's shoulders. She could see her body there. Didn't bother her, didn't scare her. She saw all the utensils they were using. She heard them talking about her arteries because they were going in.
But how can we know she's telling the truth? How can we really know that she's actually telling the truth? I mean, people that tell these kind of stories, they just want fame, they want money, they just want attention. You can tell people anything, and you're going to always have people that believe into stuff like this, right? That's the skeptical perspective. That's the logical perspective. There's no way that your brain's going to be shut down, your eyes taped, and then you're going to be able to see stuff, right? That's just impossible. Unless you're dreaming. Maybe she's just relaying a dream. But she wouldn't be dreaming if her brain was flatlined. So either the surgery didn't come off perfect, maybe this whole thing didn't really work the way it was supposed to work. Maybe there was a malfunction in all of this. We don't know. This is just what we're told. Anyways, let's keep going.
Through her femoral arteries, and she heard someone say the right one's too small, and she heard someone else say, okay, let's go into the left, which is exactly what happened and exactly what was said. The surgeons are already mind blown because of the things that she's saying. Now, the second part is the more, what we'd say, like mystical part, right? At first, it's just, mouth dropping because she is basically describing all these things that she shouldn't be able to describe. She somehow has had consciousness outside of her body, telling the surgeons that she was there and she knows what they did. And she was accurate in what she was saying. Okay, so that's one, strange. Then she says she could see a little peak of light coming from somewhere, and she turned around and started following that light. The more she was following that light, the more it basically engulfed her and made her feel peaceful and happy and like home, like she was glad to be there. Then she started sensing people who have already died before her. I believe she saw, I think it was her dad and her uncle, and then other people some people she didn't recognize, some people she did, but all of them she was happy to see, and she knew them somehow, okay? She did remember asking the people there, is the light God? And they said something like, no, it's not God. Something like the thoughts of God, and basically God is in us all, we are all connected, was like the message, right? So
all right, so that's the mystical experience of Pam Reynolds. All of that happened while she was under, her blood drained from her body, and all of these experiences supposedly happened, and veridical. She could talk about what the surgeons were talking about and things that were going on in the operating room. This is very common, actually. When I spoke to folks who had near-death experiences, these are the sort of things that they would talk about. Same kind of stuff all the time. Can be very compelling, but there's always room for doubt. There's always room for skepticism either way. And one thing I try to do is I try not to really be hyper skeptical and just have my mind made up on stuff. That wouldn't be skepticism. That would be being over reliability into your own rational mind. We know that our minds are prone to be wrong about things. There's things we don't know about reality. So, if history is a guide, we shouldn't really be surprised by a lot of stuff. But until you know, then you can't really say something's true. That's my only point here. Now, for these folks that had their experience, maybe they feel that this experience really did reflect some reality that they were experiencing. It wasn't like a hallucination or a dream, that they were actually in heaven, or with God or with their dead loved ones and all of this stuff. As far as they're concerned, this thing was more real than real. But if we take that on face value, as an idealist, this may cause a problem. Because on idealism, there is just the greater fundamental mind, which isn't necessarily metaconscious. There's nothing in idealism that says that should be the case. So this mentality or mind-like thing that is the fundamental, this realization quality, is what there is. And once the ego dies, the mind dies, then that's gone. It's no longer there. Just like on materialism, for example. Right? And so this kind of causes, these sort of stories seem to cause someone like Bernardo Kastrup a problem, because, he speaks about idealism all the time. He's an analytical idealist. And so, like I said, the other day, he was, talking about the near-death experiences and how it relates to idealism. And he started voicing some concerns about how this stuff actually challenges idealism itself. So we'll take a listen to that as well. Let me go ahead.
Experience modulated by the outside world in a way that is veridical, while the channel of that modulation is not working. It is incredibly problematic. I find it incredibly problematic. I do not know how to bring this in without throwing away the specificity of analytic idealism. And for a long time, I was okay with it because I was doing one of two moves, and sometimes both: dismissing the data as anecdotal, or manipulating the data so it fits the theory. So saying, well, they are not actually seeing, it's just that their vocabulary is a visual vocabulary, but they are just absorbing that information, and they are themselves then, after the fact, translating that into visual language, because that's all the language they have. I've done this for years, and I thought this was plausible for years. I no longer think it is plausible. It is too detailed. It gets to a point where, if you are honest to yourself, you look at yourself in the mirror and you ask yourself, can I keep doing this? And you realize, no, I can't. But now I'm incurring full on the fallacy of manipulating data to fit the theory. And under any other circumstances, if what these guys were reporting could be reconciled with my theory, I would take the reports at face value. I wouldn't go and start trying to bend and manipulate it. No, I would say, no, guys, this is what they are saying. Either we believe them and we take it in, or we don't believe them. But you can't believe them and say, but they don't quite mean what they're saying. That's what.
Yeah, that's the problem. You've got two choices here. You can either believe what they're saying, that they actually see and hear things after their brain is offline, they have a cardiac, or they shouldn't have any sort of experience at all. Yet they have these veridical experiences like the one I just showed with Pam Reynolds, where they can tell you what's going on in the operating room with timestamps exactly as it was said, and it shocks the surgeons and all of this stuff, even though their brain is offline. How does that happen? So either they're lying or they're confused somehow, but which doesn't make sense. Or idealism and naturalism is just wrong. It's just the wrong description of reality. That's the dichotomy that Bernardo Kastrup seems to be having. And I've got my own thoughts on this, though.
That's how I would react. So I feel that now that it is my theory that is in the firing line, I have to react the same way at the cost of my intellectual honesty. I will lose analytic idealism before I lose my intellectual honesty. So I do not know what to do with it today.
So he's thinking, it sounds pretty bad. This is, one of the top idealists in the realm of idealism. He's a top speaker, public speaker. And he feels that this is a threat to his worldview, these NDEs. He doesn't know what to do with it. Apparently he wants to take on board these people's experiences as true. And if they are true, then it's going to defeat idealism 100%. 100%. Because the human minds are just fractals in a way. They're sort of like disassociated minds, limited minds. And the ego is just a construction of that limited mind. And once these minds dissipate, they no longer exist. It's like the story he tells of, the whirlpool. The whirlpool is just an excitation in the lake or in the ocean or whatever. You can't take the whirlpool out and take it anywhere. It's just a process of nature. It's just a process. But it's all part of the same ocean, true. It's got the water. The water is what sort of ties everything together. It's the substrate. It never ceases. And he's saying the water is the consciousness. But that expression, the whirlpool, that's the ego. That's the identification. That's the structure of a being, of a limited mind, is that whirlpool. So once you die, that process stops. That whirlpool joins the ocean again. It's no longer a disassociated ego. So how does NDEs make sense within that view?
And the only way out that I discern is I have them to abandon naturalism. But if I have to do that, I don't want to play the game anymore. It's a game I don't want to play. I don't know, but I don't find it productive to play the game without naturalism. Because I feel like I'll be shooting in every direction. And if I happen to be right, it's by pure luck, pure chance. I don't want to play that game. It's like a roulette game. I'd rather play chess. The summary of my train of thought is this. To wiggle our way out of the dilemma, we have to find a way to account for being able to see without eyes. But if we find that way, we have now to account for why we have eyes and why we stop seeing when we close our eyes. I'm talking about anecdotal evidence here. there seems to be something individual and inborn that we seem to take with us from before birth, from before fecundation, something that seems to have been there already before, prior to entering this game. Is this incoherent under analytic idealism? No, it is not. It is just inflationary. And without positive reason to entertain this hypothesis, we must discard it in philosophical discourse based on Occam's razor. And we talked.
And, Occam's razor is a virtue in philosophy. So he's sort of peacocking that virtue. Bernardo Kastrup has always virtue signaled for Occam's razor, parsimony. But we know in reality, parsimony is not a hard, fast rule. In fact, when we learn the true nature of things, when we make observations, when we finally are able to observe certain things, we realize that they're not very parsimonious at all. In fact, you look at hydrodynamics, for example. The most parsimonious view was that, to explain the flow of water, you look at molecules, and molecules seem to go in one direction, and then that seems to fit the data of water flowing in one direction. So that's probably the most parsimonious explanation for the flow of water in hydrodynamics. But as we learn, that's not the case. Molecules don't do that. They're all over the place. It's very, reality turns out to be very messy, very dynamic. But I understand that Occam's razor is a good guide. When you don't know something, you don't want to make more assumptions than necessary. But for me, I know that reality doesn't work by the rules of Occam's razor at all. Yeah, we look at the example of epicycles among within epicycles, the Ptolemaic view or whatever. To explain the orbits of the planets and the so-called changing of the direction. Oh, well, it's just epicycles within epicycles within epicycles, and this explains the data of what we see. But we know that was very unparsimonious. It created a whole bunch of assumptions that turned out to not be true at all. But that's one case. But there's also many, many, many other cases where parsimony is not how reality actually turned out to be. There's a lot to it. The most parsimonious view, let's say you were to take a cell phone to some lost tribe somewhere that didn't know what cell phones were at all, and you let them play with the phone and they could hear voices in the phone or whatever. The most parsimonious view would be they could take it apart. They could take out the little chip in the phone or the battery or something in the phone wouldn't work. It's, so this is what it is. The phone, the battery is what's producing the voices we hear when we talk on the phone. If we take out this battery, then it takes away the voice that we hear and the light on the phone and every other thing about the phone. So obviously, the phone, the voices are an emergent property of this battery here in the phone. That's the most parsimonious view if you didn't know any better. And that would be kind of logical. But as it turns out, that's not how phones work at all. They work with cell towers and broadcasting and channels and signals in the air and Wi-Fi and all the things that make cell phones possible. So as it turns out, the most parsimonious view is not always the real thing in real life, right? That's the problem with the, but it is a good way as a guide. And I think you'll go into that most likely.
About Occam's razor last week. I gave you some dramatic examples of why we need to take Occam's razor seriously, even though it's not a rule of nature etched in stone. So this is one reason, that this inborn character that we all seem to have, like we have some kind of individual history before we popped in here. That there seems to be something about it, you know. Another reason is the clear delineation between the nervous system and the rest of the body.
I can turn your wildest ideas into a song. Just describe.
It's like the nervous system inhabits the body. The reason to not go farther with this, not extrapolate this into any metaphysical sense, is that the cells in the nervous system have the same DNA as the cells of the rest of the body. And of course, they both differentiate from the same primordial zygote, the same single cell organism that we start life as. And yet there is this feeling that I inhabit my body, that I control it like a virtual reality headset controlling a drone. And we think we are the drone because we are wearing this virtual reality headset. So there is this, and then there is the anecdotal evidence. And when I say anecdotal, I don't dismiss it. I'm using anecdotal here in a very strict formal sense. It's anecdotal evidence in the sense that it's not evidence produced under controlled laboratory conditions. That's all I mean by it. I'm not saying that it's invalid because it's anecdotal. Goodness knows, science started purely with anecdotal evidence. That's what we have before we design an experiment. But the anecdotal evidence suggests some form of dualism. And some reports are very consistent with naturalism. Anita Morgami, whatever, her reports of how it was like when she met her father. She says, I became my father. That's a very naturalist report. But some other reports, I cannot deny, are very, very dualistic in nature. And I've done the cumbersome exercise of trying to interpret those reports in a purely naturalistic sense. And sometimes,
yeah, dualism, the idea that there's the mind and then there's the body, or there's the soul and then there's the body, has a long religious tradition, especially in religions like the Abrahamic religions, for example, and even some Vedic traditions. Dualism is a thing, and our experience of the world is pretty dualistic. So it makes you wonder, how can idealism be true as a non-dual philosophy if you have these out-of-body experiences, these NDEs? This is a splitting of the consciousness from the physical body. How does that work? Hey, Joe, how you doing, man? And by the way, if anybody wants to join, go ahead and jump in. I'm about to end the video here soon and kind of talk about how maybe these NDEs, if they are true, if the afterlife is true, how they would defeat idealism, or maybe ways that it wouldn't, because it does seem pretty dualistic, metaphysically speaking. Yeah, no, look at Bernardo's panel. Yeah, he does this like every week, I think, and it's always feel that's not even that much. Usually it's way more than that. Actually, he has a lot of folks joining his discussions, almost as much as mine, right? Yeah, I wish.
As I succeed, often I fail. And sometimes to succeed, you really have to change what the person said. You have to start going down the line of, oh, he didn't mean it quite the way he said.
Yes.
Okay, if you open that door, okay, now everything will be consistent with your views, because now you're taking the liberty to changing the evidence as per your, predispositions and biases and prejudices. So if I don't do that, I have to acknowledge that a lot of what people are talking about suggest that there was some form of individuality before birth and some form of individuality and life, personal history, that personal individual history that is remembered and persists after the end of the dissociation. So all of this is coherent under analytic idealism. You could have a natural process in which a sort of a door opens, a dissociative door opens, through which an existing complex in the general neighborhood in mind sort of
It's just very inflationary. That's the only problem that I see with it. It's a very inflationary proposal. I guess what we would have to do is we'd have to know whether the afterlife was really true. If we could nail that one down, then we could start exploring those sort of avenues. Because, you think about nature, why do we have eyes and ears and perceptions at all? Why would nature go through millions of years to evolve eyes and ears and hearing when you don't really need to? All you have to do is be a spirit that sees and hears, and it seems like it's already there. Why this dualistic story? That's the whole problem with dualism, is that it seems redundant. You have that redundancy fallacy going on. But like I said, in the world, things are never turn out to be as parsimonious as we sort of assume they should be. It's more like a guide. Hey, Joel, how's it going, my friend?
Hey, Scott, what's up?
Nothing much, man. I was listening to Bernardo Kastrup yesterday, and he brought up a whole lot of concerns he has. He's been going on about when people usually ask him about near-death experiences and idealism, what his thoughts are. And he's always either taken the route of, well, they're just anecdotes that can be explained either by people lying, or maybe they're just confused and they're having dreams or whatever, or, something else, right? But on idealism, an afterlife would kind of be a problem. But he's been voicing concerns that he's getting this question more and more, and he's looking into the research, the stories and the things, and he's starting to come around like, how long can I keep this up? How long can I really keep saying that, oh, these people, I know what they're saying, but they don't really mean what they're saying? Or the other thing, that they're just telling lies, or you can't believe them. And so he
confused.
Or they're confused. Yeah. And he's saying it's almost like I'm trying to twist the story in order to fit my worldview, which is a fallacy.
Okay.
So he says this is kind of a problem. What do you think?
Can you connect the dots for me? Why is an afterlife, why would that be like disproving idealism?
Well, idealism, is another naturalistic worldview. So it's just a worldview that turns, consciousness is a natural thing in the world, right? So it's not supernatural. Consciousness isn't a supernatural thing. So, when you talk about afterlife,
I think there are people who think it is a supernatural thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I'm just saying, if you go within the view itself, especially the way Bernardo Kastrup outlines it.
Okay.
So for him, it's a problem.
Necessarily a supernatural thing?
Yes. Generally, it's viewed as supernatural. It's sort of like magical thinking, because
I get that it's generally part of ideas that we would say, well, that's supernatural. But I'm just saying, like, if we were to say, when you die, you when your body dies, that's not the end of your experience, that you have some experience after that. And we were just to stipulate that that's just what happens naturally. There isn't anything supernatural about it. Then what would we point to and say, no, it has to be supernatural?
Mm. Well, I guess that's a good question.
I'm betting
Well,
that this is hard to answer because it's hard for us to say what's natural and what's supernatural in general. If you were to try to nail down what makes the distinction between one and the other, a lot of people might be hard pressed. They'd want to kind of appeal to, well, magic, spirits, they just kind of want to say, well, these things that we generally put in that category. But in my mind, there's always this question of, if we found out that any one of those things was really real, would there be any reason not to say, well, this must be a part of the natural world that we are just learning about, right? A lot
I
of times I
guess
think that's
maybe the
difference is
question
like,
could be, well, here's a way to approach it. So idealism, just like or metaphysical idealism versus metaphysical materialism, both of those things are sort of like non-dual philosophies, right? If there is an afterlife, if we learn that it's just a natural part of the world, that you do have a soul that goes on, would that defeat non-dualism? Would it promote dualism?
I'm not sure if we're talking about, dualism in reference to what's fundamental to reality, then and I'm always saying this to you guys on here, I don't see any way to point to things as they are or as they're not and say, this has to be because reality at the fundamental level is, dualist or non-dualist. I hear a lot of people make those kinds of assertions, but I never get any kind of, real connection, uh, any reasonable inference between, if reality is fundamentally X, then this logically follows. This is entailed. Those always seem to be based on people's assumptions when you dig into it.
Correct. That's kind of like why over the over the course of time, I sort of kind of backed off from these dichotomies, and I sort of look at it more from a mereological nihilistic sort of view. I talk about that all the time as well. And so just depending on your perspective, you can see dualism, you can also see non-dualism, but you can't outright assume that it's one or the other just based on that one perspective. So in a way, it's sort of like what's said in the Upanishads, in the Vedic traditions, that it's actually both, just depending on your perspective and how you approach it. Now we had a comment here from Ryan members. Afterlife assumes death. Death is not real. So this kind of gets into words don't mean what they mean problem. It's like, why do we have a word called death? What is death really talking about?
I mean, you can say that death isn't what we think it is, but it is still the thing that we call death.
Right.
It's definitely real. It happens all around us all the time. To the extent that there are people who think that there's more, that's not the end of the experience. It's it puts what we call death in a very different light, but it's still there. It's still kind of the division between before and after.
Yeah, because we have language to talk about these sort of things we observe in the world, and they kind of lose their meaning and value when we just kind of say that these words don't reflect reality at all. I think they do, but it's like you said, I think they just maybe not mean what they mean. But I think one of the points that you made is very good. It would be great if we could somehow prove or demonstrate in the same with the same weight as anything else that we take as real, this afterlife. Until then, it becomes sort of in the air. It becomes just possibilities, and I guess that's the way I'm talking about it. However, at the beginning of this stream, I did play a hospice nurse who was exploring the case of Pam Reynolds. I don't know if you're familiar with that case, but this is a person who apparently had an aneurysm deep in her brain, in her brain tissue, and they had to drain all the blood out of her body, or most of it, bring her body down to very low temperatures to where she was literally, they call it hyperthermic cardiac arrest. There's no blood. She's essentially dead for all intents and purposes. Her brain is flatlined. Her heart is flatlined. Everything. She's pretty much clinically dead. They put these little things in her ear that's like a little clicking sound, and that's how you measure brain activity. So if she was to hear anything, which she couldn't, it would be impossible anyways, all she would be able to hear is this clicking, very loud clicking sound. Now, as she came out of that surgery, the successful surgery, she reported, conversations in the operating room while she was dead. There were clocks, she had timestamps. She was able to talk about a lot of things that were going on. She could see things, hear things. There were actually in the operating, and it left the surgeon stunned or whatever. It's been well documented by the surgeon. It's considered like a huge mystery. And some people point to those type of things as all the evidence you need. That's the only way you're really going to ever prove the afterlife, if there is any way to prove it, is through this sort of veridical reports. And while they're anecdotal, all of science starts out as anecdotal, and then you test for it and you do these things and that. And this is sort of that indirect experience, indirect evidence, you might say, for an afterlife. What do you think about, what is your opinion about that?
Is it evidence of afterlife? Even if we accept it on the face of it, that while her body was what we would consider unconscious, we would think, well, that person's not going to know what's going on because all of those things that you listed. What we would say, if we assumed that the evidence, is true on its face, and just say, okay, and she somehow knew these things, then what we aren't talking about is, we aren't talking about someone's soul going to heaven or hell, right? We're not talking about someone whose body is dead and gone, floating around like a ghost. We're not talking about any of those things. We're talking about a person who was, in a state where we would have assumed they were unconscious, and somehow they were not. So we don't know the answer to why that is. I think if anyone were to say, I know why it is, they're leaping to a conclusion that they can't possibly justify. Because really what's going on here is something that we can't explain. So to treat it as evidence for your conclusion, any conclusion, is faulty. It's just a mistake to say, whoa, here's something that we weren't expecting and we can't explain, therefore my conclusion. That's bad logic.
Can you think of any examples in science where we do that all the time? Like scientists will leap to theories or models that explain reality that are kind of the same way. Like, I don't know.
I think it's important to recognize that, like, leaping to a hypothesis, for instance, and remember that a hypothesis is something that you can test. So let's say someone's looking at evidence and they do that kind of that kind of logical leap that I was just saying is bad. What I had said was that acting like it's evidence for your conclusion is bad. Treating it, letting your brain get creative in order to come up with hypothesis that you can test is not the fallacy. The fallacy is when you come up with a conclusion that you cannot test, like there's an afterlife. You know, why is this lady able to
Right.
say what happened while she was unconscious? Well, because there's an afterlife, right? That's the fallacy. The fallacy is not saying, hey, what if we came up with an explanation that we could test? Yeah, be as creative as you want to be, as long as you're in that realm of testability. But when you go, oh, I came up with an explanation I can't test, I could never demonstrate as true, and we can't disprove in any way, well, but we should still treat it like evidence. I think that's
Mm,
the mistake.
mm. Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, I personally, I mean, just on my own personal view, I kind of like the fact that it leaves open all possibilities, things like this. Because look, if we had all the answers to everything and we knew absolute everything to be known, then we would have nothing to really talk about. We would have nothing to really ponder about and wonder. It sort of takes the wonder out of reality in a way. It's kind of cool when you don't have all the answers. It's kind of cool when you can have that space to be creative in your thinking.
Absolutely. We enjoy it, obviously.
Yeah.
But hey,
Yeah.
Scott, good talking to you this morning. I'm going to
Yeah,
jump
man.
off real
Thanks for
quick and
jumping
get
on
back to
by.
things.
Okay, man.
Yeah, appreciate you having me as always.
Yeah, brother. Thank you so much.
All right, later, man.
Later on, brother. Yeah, and if anybody else wants to jump in and join the conversation, I've got the link in the live chat. Just go ahead and click on the link and join me, talk about it. Are you a believer and why? I know that I think it was Ryan who said that afterlife assumes death. Death is not real. So that's sort of a positive claim that death is not real. And I think what you mean by that is death isn't necessarily what we think it is, that maybe it's just another transformation, so to speak. And by the way, even though I've said a lot of these things and I've tried to give a little pushback on everything, like I said, I don't like to be hyper skeptical. I like to leave myself open to other views and those views sometimes. I like I said, I used to go to these weekly meetings at the IANS, which is the International Association of Near-Death Studies, and I really went through a lot of time researching this stuff with people who've had these near-death. Very compelling, by the way. I'm not even going to lie to you. Very compelling, very interesting. I didn't get the impression that they were trying to bullshit me or anything like that. Actually, if I'm honest, one or two people did, but for the most part, I didn't feel that people were really trying to bullshit me on a lot of stuff or bullshit us at these meetings. And so I'm open, and I'm open to be wrong about idealism. I'm open to say that maybe the afterlife could be, if it was true, it could be a natural thing, but it seems to have implications about whether duality and non-duality is true metaphysically. It seems that way. But I'm just looking to see if maybe there's other ways that it isn't, or maybe that dualism and non-dualism are just dichotomies that sort of set ourselves up. That's sort of the illusion of the limited mind. Maybe we're the ones who try to define reality through our labeling and through our language and things like that. I tend to think that's the case. I mean, but we have to do it, don't we? We have to have some sort of baseline or referent in order to make claims and deny claims. And we have to have some sort of ontological grounding, you know, or at least epistemic grounding, maybe is the better word. Epistemic grounding for thinking what's possible and impossible. And a lot of this has to do with what we experience, even though our experience of reality is limited too. We don't really experience everything about reality. So we can be wrong, but epistemically, it may be more parsimonious to base our ideas on things we know to be the case in our experience rather than things that are assumed too much, you know? Because then it's not so parsimonious. Then we get back into this thing I was saying about epicycles within epicycles to explain things, right? It's not very parsimonious. It's open to a lot of points of failure. This could be one of those things. Maybe this whole dichotomy between dualism and non-dualism is a trap in some kind of way. If anybody, does anyone have any thoughts on that? I think it's worthy to sort of look at, and I'm open to hear anyone's suggestions on this. Now, a lot of people say that, well, they feel that, you know, afterlife stories are just a product of wishful thinking, you know, and you have to be suspicious of things. You know how your mom or dad may have told you, if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. And so people treat things like afterlives and gods and rewards of the afterlife as just too good to be true. You know, that there's this cosmic justice system that will burn the bad people in hell and reward the good people in heaven. You know, maybe this is just wishful thinking, and it sort of influences our beliefs. That's why, you know, for me, I'm more agnostic on a lot of things. I leave these things sort of open, but I am willing to discuss it and let's engage, you know, in these things. It opens up a lot of questions like, why did we evolve to live here on the earth as we do? If there's this afterlife, why couldn't we just be in the afterlife to begin with? You know, why it's kind of like that old thing about, you know, when you die, you know, you go to heaven, but this earth is a test and there's all this evil and stuff we have to work through. Why do we have to do any of that? Why not just create everybody in heaven perfectly? Well, there's arguments against that, I'm sure. Maybe that's the point. It's kind of like going to the gym. You know, if you go to the gym and work out, yeah, it's very strenuous and it's painful and all of that, but you learn something, you gain, you know, you gain, no pain, no gain sort of thing. And that's the whole purpose of this life here, this incarnation, so to speak. Soul building, the soul building story. But then we have a lot of problems with that too. People will say, well, it's sort of sadistic. And some people will deny God and deny that these things can be possible because all the, you know, infants being abused and killed and murdered and all of these sort of things create this problem of evil, you know, this unnecessary suffering we see in the world. How do you justify that? It seems to be a means to an end fallacy. And so that's rejected on those bases, right? And I tend to agree. I sort of empathize or sympathize with that view. That's what sort of shapes my view of idealism, that whatever this mind-like thing is, it can't really be personal in the sense of some all-loving, you know, old man in the sky God type thing, because now we have the problem of evil. So how do we explain that? right? Now, people oftentimes say it with idealism that if everything is mind, then mind is everything. I don't know if that's quite right. Even the concept of everything is already a mental construction. Everything is a boundary concept. It draws a line around like totality. But what actually draws that line? The mind. Mind is not another object, say, within the set of all objects, but mind is what makes sets possible. So mind is kind of what makes distinctions possible, these dichotomies we're talking about. Mind is what allows identity to sort of emerge. So you cannot define mind because definition sort of presupposes that, right? You can't really locate mind because location appears within mind. You can't objectify it because objectification is its activity. It sounds kind of paradoxical, but that's the whole point that I'm driving at. Mind is the condition for the possibility of all these paradoxes. So here could be a deep claim, right? Mind is what draws the boundary between everything and nothing. So without awareness, there's no distinction like this, afterlife versus life. No this, no that, no is not. Mind is not a thing among other things, so to speak, right? It's kind of the field in which the thingness emerges. So this means idealism isn't really saying reality is made of mental stuff. It's mainly saying like reality is intelligibility, and reality is the appearance or the structure of experience. Mind is sort of that ground of structure. And if that was true, then what we call nature is already a subset. It's kind of like a pattern within a larger mental field. Right? So you can kind of look at the brain as a filter. Now, this is where I guess the afterlife question becomes sort of interesting. If mind is fundamental, then what is the brain? What's its role? So on many like idealist models, like including Kastrup, the brain is not a generator of the consciousness. It's more like a filter. So that idea has kind of roots in like the old William James thing, who proposed like this transmission theory of consciousness. Like the brain constrains it, it localizes, narrows it, limits it, structures it. It's kind of like Sophia always talks about, it's kind of like white light passing through a prism. And then the prism does not create the light, it just refracts the light. So in that sense, the human mind may be like a localized disassociation within that, field of mind. So what would happen when that prism breaks? Does the light disappear, or does it just return to the broader field, that white light? So under this model, the afterlife does not really violate idealism necessarily. It follows naturally from it. So that's one way you could argue about that, right? That's one way you could kind of look at it. So let me look at some of these comments. Eamon, I believe in reincarnation, but it's not very comforting because according to some reports, a person who's murdered can suffer the effects of their injuries in the form of birth defects. Yeah, I've heard about that. That's what birth defects are. It's kind of like the karma or the cause behind it. So that doesn't suggest karma exists, at least not it's usually conceived. Well, that's debatable because I was just reading or looking at Swarma, who's a Hindu in one of the Vedic traditions. And he talks a lot about the Upanishads and talks about karma in that way. I think an afterlife could be reconciled with idealism if we persist in a disembodied form, but imagine our bodies the way we imagine them in dreams. Yeah, it could be just like going into another construct or a dream, if you want to use that sort of analogy. I would sort of agree with that. That's could be a way to reconcile that. Like an afterlife would simply be another modality of experience, like another configuration of mental structure, not really supernatural, just trans-physical, you could call it. Like the real challenge for me is not whether an afterlife really defeats idealism. It's the real challenge of can it explain individuality? Like, can idealism explain individuality? Like, if all is mind, why am I not you? Why is there that disassociation at all? Well, like, why limitation? Why finitude? And this is kind of where the filter model, I guess, could become crucial. Like individuality may be structured by that limitation of our brain. Like not an illusion, not a mistake in that way, but just another model of experience, another construct. So if the afterlife were true, would it really defeat idealism? I mean, I don't think necessarily. I think idealism may be the only framework in which it makes metaphysical sense, you could argue. Because like under idealism, mind is not an object in the universe. The universe is that appearance within that mind, right? So mind cannot be defined because it is the thing that defines. You know, it's not located, it's the one that locates. So mind is kind of what draws that boundary between everything and nothing. So if the brain is that filter and not really a generator necessarily, then death may not be the annihilation at all. It may just be the removal of a certain kind of constraint. Now, that doesn't prove the afterlife. It doesn't mean that idealism does not collapse if one exists. If anything, it just kind of deepens it, right? So you can make that move. That's what I'm saying. So it's kind of like what you said here, that it could be persist in a disembodied form, but imagine our bodies the way we imagine them in dreams. Yeah. Like, and I've heard some people say when they describe an afterlife that the afterlife appears physical as well, that it's the same thing as here. You know, you have constraints in the afterlife. Some people talk about that, like just the different constraints. So there's a sort of freedom, a feeling of freedom, like especially when you're going through that disassociation from the brain. They'll say that, you know, when I lift off the body, they use that language. I'm lifting out of my body and I'm floating out of my body. That's the impression. But I've had those feelings too. Like I practice a lot of lucid dreaming. I like to get into lucid dreaming states. And some of these result in out-of-body experiences. And it is just that. You feel like you're floating. But once you float into this other domain, if you want to call it that, there's constraints there too. In fact, if you're not careful, you'll fall right back into your normal state of being. Like you'll become scared, you'll become fearful. Like that's my problem. Like I'm trying to figure out how to stop being so goddamn panicky. Because like when I have these out-of-body experiences, what happens is once I feel that vertigo, I guess. Like I have this real dizzy, floaty feeling. And then I freak out, like when I look, like somehow I'm looking back at the room or my body or something, and it just scares the shit out of me, and I panic. And I fall right back into my body. Like I've gotten used to the sleep paralysis part. So just to kind of let you guys know how this shit works, because I'm a psychonaut, you know, I do all kinds of crazy tests with my consciousness. So what I do is I get myself into a sleep paralysis. So the way scientifically you describe that is you get into a REM sleep, which is like random eye movement. What that means is you're kind of like between the wake state and the sleep state. So you kind of like in a dream and also you're conscious of your surroundings at the same time. So in that state, you can sort of see your dreams. And if you get really good at it, you can start to lucid dream. You can go into your dream and out of this reality, so to speak. But what happens, part of that is your body naturally starts going into this paralysis. They call it a night terror when you're awake during this paralysis, because your body, for natural reasons, your body will free. Otherwise, you'll sleepwalk. You know, you'll sleepwalk, possibly hurt yourself. So your body's protection in that is you'll become paralyzed, you know? So you'll go through this paralysis, sleep paralysis. And this freaks a lot of people out. And it used to freak me out too until I got used to it. And I started to like it. Because in this paralysis, you can't move, you can't talk, you can't scream. But the really weird thing about the surreal thing is you're in REM sleep. You have rapid eye movement. So you're dreaming and your eyes are moving based on your mental activity. So, you know, in your dream, you're looking here or there, whatever, and your physical eyes map right along with that. And you're highly suggestive in that state. This is why hypnosis works. You can get someone into that state and you can suggest certain things like what they experience, even what they experience after they come out of their hypnosis. Like it's highly suggestive. So if you are open to it, if you let yourself be hypnotized, or if you let yourself go through sleep paralysis as well, you can get into that lucid dreaming state. But you have to be a willing participant. This is why most people don't experience lucid dreams or out-of-body experiences. Most people just want to go to sleep. That's what we do. But some people, we want to have these weird experiences like me. And so we've kind of like tried to train ourselves to get into these states, these mind states or brain states. And yeah, it's really fascinating. But the whole point is that you sort of go through this other dream state, which has its own sort of constraints. So maybe when you actually die, when you really die, if this whole afterlife thing is true, that is, maybe you go into another construct that has its own constraints. At least that's what a lot of folks have told me who claim to have had these near-death experiences. My only question is, are they just going through a form of REM or lucid dreaming? Are they just going into a form of that? Now, there is differences. Like, you know, the thing about lucid dreaming is I don't come back with this profound, you know, life-changing thing. People who have near-death experiences almost always come back changing careers, letting go of their religious beliefs, or becoming very philosophical or very mystical in their attitude and approach to life. You know what I mean? Like they have this really profound effect that's like a symptom of someone who's had an NDE. I don't have those same symptoms just by lucid dreaming. So they're totally different things. Same with DMT trips. You know, I've had trips on DMT. Very profound, very much more profound than lucid dreaming. And kind of did change me in many ways, but not to the extent that these NDEs do. Not to that extent. And they don't all share the same sort of experience. Like with the NDEs, you know, the commonalities aren't there with DMT trips or lucid dreaming. You don't see the tunnel, the light, the extreme peace, the dead loved ones, the life review. These are all the commonalities, regardless of culture, regardless of influence, you know, in your life. You could be an atheist, you could have an NDE with these same commonalities. You could be a Christian, a Hindu, whatever. Everyone reports these same sort of experiences. So there is a constraint there. That's right there. That's a constraint right there. It's just a lot different than your lucid dreaming sort of scenario. Has anybody ever had an NDE out there that can speak on it? I'd love to hear more about it. That would be awesome if you've got any experience you can share. I've got the link in the live chat. Let me know what's up, man. I've got a little time, and I definitely would like to talk to you guys about that. It's very fascinating stuff. Now I know, and I'm also a skeptic. And maybe I could challenge a skeptic just for my own skepticism. If you want to say that these things are the imagination and they are extraordinary claims that don't have extraordinary evidence, let's dissect that. Let's take a look at that. That's the whole point of philosophy, man. Let's challenge our base assumptions or unknown assumptions going in. You know, and this sort of goes into beliefs and skepticism and the stories we tell, right? Like, you know, one of the things I do is I write Substack articles, and I recently published a Substack article on that very sort of thing called Belief, Skepticism, and the Stories We Live By. And one of the things that I like to bring out is that we human beings, we like to imagine that we either believe or disbelieve in things like God because we follow the evidence wherever it leads. So we sort of picture ourselves as rational agents that stand above the fray. We weigh arguments like impartial judges in life, right? And that picture is kind of flattering, but it's incomplete. So what we've come to learn is that we're not merely or only logical processors. We're also creatures shaped by emotions like fear, longing, identity, attachments, and storytelling. So we have convictions about like the supernatural, but they're rarely born in just off reason alone. They emerge from the depths of our existential concerns, like our fears. And if we're honest, like really honest, we're going to admit that our emotional relationships to a claim often precedes our rational defense of those claims. If we're honest about that. And it's the same thing when you're a skeptic. Who is me? 1669 says, I am a Hindu and more than the existence of God. I'm scared of an afterlife, so much so that I literally have anxiety attacks before doing anything, fearing that it'll have consequences. Yeah, I was talking about that last week on my show, or this weekend on my show, that in a way, I don't know if I want there to be an afterlife, because if so, what does that mean? Like, we like to imagine that we are floating on a cloud, taking a harp lesson, or, you know, worshiping God every day, singing in the choir, whatever. But what if it's not like that at all? What if the afterlife is just floating around in the void forever, bored out of your fucking mind, going insane, or having no sensory input at all? How numbing that would be. How sterile an existence that would be. It's kind of like the ethical questions of, even if we could grow a brain in a vat, would we really want to? Because it would have no sensory input, no body, no sort of natural challenge or whatever. Now, some people say, well, if there is an afterlife and it's a natural thing, then nature would give it, just like we have here in this world. But this world itself has a lot of suffering and a lot of hell in it too. The difference is this one comes to an end. An afterlife may not come to an end. How would you like that, to be in some hellish existence forever? That would suck. And what if you're reincarnated and have to do this shit all over again, but this time in a worse body, in a worse person, with a fucked up brain that you have no control of, like you're a maniac or a psychotic. There's a lot of people who are psychopaths who hate their existence. You would think psychopaths are people that like to kill people or like to do all these weird things. A lot of these psychopaths say it's terrible. It's not like I chose to be this way. It's like, people who have these compulsions to do harm to others. It's out of their control. That's the whole point. It's out of their control. They didn't choose to be that way. What a hellish existence. To do things that you probably don't want to do. The afterlife could be that way. I agree. People oftentimes think it's one of those stories that's too good to be true. That could be an illusion. That could be someone saying, so overly affected by our Western thought, like our influence of Christianity in the Bible. It's a carryover. Like a skeptic could say, oh, I don't believe in the afterlife. I'm suspicious of it because it's just too good to be true sort of stuff. It's wishful thinking. Well, maybe you're just carrying that baggage into the concept. Maybe there's nothing wishful about it if you really knew what it was. So that doesn't really play a role in whether it's true or not. The fact that you're suspicious of what it means, because you don't know what it means, and you don't know whether it's true or not at all. You don't know whether you see reality as it really is based on your rationality. Maybe you're putting too much stock into your abilities to be rational. And that's kind of what my Substack article was about. If anybody wants to read it, I'll put it up here in the live chat as well. Take a look at it. Subscribe to me, man. I put articles out all the time. I'm a professional mental masturbator. And I'm good at mental masturbation. No, but I like to talk about these sort of stuff, beliefs and epistemology and ontology and these sort of things, So yeah, man, the afterlife is a good question. Does it defeat naturalism? Does it defeat analytical idealism? I don't think necessarily. That's my conclusion. I think it's just more stuff about, if we found out it was true, it would just be more stuff about the natural world that we've learned. It's like everything was once supernatural, like lightning, for example. But then when we found out how it worked and that it was, it's kind of like the story I like is the one about meteorites and stuff like that. Meteorites are pretty rare, but people have always observed them. So when people talked about meteorites, like rocks falling from the sky, it was considered woo-woo bullshit. Because look, rocks are on the ground. Why would they fall from the sky? Why wouldn't they just stay in the sky if they were really there? And how do they fall from the sky? Why should we even believe such things? You know, it's but then we learned it was a real thing. Now it's no longer super, it's just part of the natural world. We have an expanded view of the natural world that can explain these things better. Maybe the afterlife is sort of like that. Who is me 1669? Can you explain what the spoon scene meant in the Matrix? I've been struggling to understand it too. Too much metaphor. So yeah, so what I understood with that is that the spoon is not there. In other words, it's a mental construct. So to make the spoon bend, you have to stop conceiving it as a solid object that you have to force it to move and bend based on those things. Then in actuality, the spoon is not what you think it to be. It's not the concept spoon as you imagine it to be. It's just an appearance. And as long as that's the case, you can transcend your limited mind in order to manipulate the appearances within your mind. You start looking at things in a totally different sort of paradigm shift. And this is where we talk about psychokinesis, telepathy, things like that. I would encourage you to look at the telepathy tapes. There's experiments where they look at folks who are telepathic, and these are nonverbal autistic children. And because of their condition, their brain filter, as the way they look at it, is able to do things like telepathy. And they have experiments to prove that these claims are in fact real. So they have scientists, objective observers, come in and measure and run all sorts of tests to debunk it on purpose. Not to be mean to them. It's just that's how science works. That's the method. You try to debunk hypothesis in order to make progress on what's really going on. And so far, it's been positive to say that the telepathy is actually a thing. And so again, this is kind of like the afterlife. It sort of challenges idealism because it sort of, it can be argued that it points towards non-dualism. I mean, dualism, not non-dualism, as a metaphysical position. But like I said before, so does our everyday experience, sort of points towards dualism if you want to look at it in just that framing. The fact that I'm talking into this microphone, these are two different things, and I'm being heard by you, other conscious people, is a kind of dualism. You know, this, that. But that's just a perspective. You know, on idealism, that's just the disassociation perspective. But yeah, just to talk about that, the spoon thing, that's what I got out of it. That's how I understood it. So anyways, man, I've got to get out of here. I got to get to work, start going through my day. And I appreciate everyone who's tuned in a little bit. Like and subscribe to the channel, if you will. Do me some solids, man. I'm trying to build a channel, of course, and talk about these things. And it's interactive. You know, I've got the links and everything for folks to join and talk and interact with me. And usually, like, the big day is Saturday at 12 noon. Me and my co-host Sophia, we have different topics, and sometimes we have guests and interviews. Had a really good one this past weekend with Alex from Freebird Media, and we were talking about idealism and politics and identity politics and things like that, and how it all relates. Really good interviews. And again, if you subscribe, if you want to talk, if you have your own channel you want to promote that's philosophical in nature, let me know, man. Email me. Let me know, and let me know in the live comments what you think about life after death, if it's such a thing as life after death. Why you believe in it, why you don't. I want to hear from you. What are the ideas? Does it defeat idealism? Does it promote dualism? Let me know what's up, man. I want to expand my knowledge. But anyways, guys, you guys have a great day, and we'll talk to you later. Peace.